The story of the Black Death is one of the most devastating episodes in human history. It swept across continents in the 14th century, reshaping societies, economies, and cultures in ways that would echo for centuries. Yet beneath the horror and the staggering loss of life lies another story, one often overshadowed by the scale of the tragedy. The story of how the Black Death transformed labor rights, social mobility, and the very structure of medieval society. For millions who survived, the world they inherited was fundamentally different from the one that existed before the plague arrived. This documentary begins its journey by looking not only at the disease itself, but at the world it attacked, a world built on rigid hierarchies, deeply entrenched systems of labor, and a social order that seemed immovable until it wasn't. Before the plague struck, medieval Europe was defined by a deeply stratified social system. At the top stood monarchs and nobles who held vast estates and legal authority. Beneath them were knights and gentry, and below them the backbone of the medieval economy, peasants, serfs, and agricultural laborers who worked the land in exchange for protection. This feudal framework had been in place for centuries. It dictated what people could earn, where they could live, and even whom they could marry. The idea of social mobility was almost non-existent. A person born into serfdom could expect to die in serfdom, their children inheriting their status just as they inherited farmland and obligations. The economy of Europe depended on the predictable flow of labor from these lower classes. Fields had to be plowed, crops harvested, livestock tended, and taxes paid in grain and work. Labor was abundant, and because it was abundant, those who performed it had little power. Wages, where they existed at all, were extremely low. In many cases, peasants were tied to their lords and could not legally leave the land. This system created stability for landowners, but left the working classes with almost no rights and very limited autonomy. Into this tightly controlled world came the Black Death. It arrived in Europe around 1347, spreading along trade routes that connected cities and ports across the continent. Carried by fleas on rats, and then transmitted from person to person, the plague unleashed destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Some regions lost a third of their population, others half, and some even more. Villages emptied overnight, cities fell silent, entire family lines vanished. The routines of agricultural and urban life collapsed as fields went untended, shops closed, and households were left without caretakers. But as catastrophic as this was, the immense reduction in population created something no one could have anticipated: a massive shift in economic power. Suddenly, the labor force was no longer abundant. It was scarce, desperately scarce. Lords and landowners who had once relied on large populations to maintain their estates now faced a crisis. There were not enough people to plow fields, harvest crops, or maintain infrastructure. As a result, for the first time in centuries, workers found themselves in a position of power. With fewer laborers available, those who survived the plague discovered that their work had become valuable in ways unimaginable before the pandemic. Peasants began demanding higher wages. They sought better working conditions, lighter obligations, and more freedom. Some refused to work the land altogether unless their lords agreed to new terms. Others migrated to towns or other estates, seeking better opportunities. This mobility, once legally restricted and socially condemned, suddenly became a practical necessity for landowners desperate to lure workers to their fields. Laborers who had once been bound to their villages now found themselves negotiating wages, choosing employers, and shaping their own futures in ways that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. This shift was not welcomed by the elites. The ruling classes recognized immediately that their power was threatened by the new economic reality. In response, governments across Europe attempted to reassert control. One of the most famous examples is the English Statute of Labourers of 1351, a law designed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers from moving in search of higher pay. Similar laws were enacted across the continent. These regulations were intended to force society back into its old shape, but they largely failed. Workers ignored them, landowners violated them when it suited their interests, and enforcement proved nearly impossible in regions where authorities had been weakened by the plague. As the old systems faltered, new ones emerged. The labor shortages created an environment in which upward mobility became increasingly common. Families that had been poor for generations found opportunities to acquire land abandoned by those who had died. Skilled artisans discovered that their crafts were in high demand, allowing them to bargain for better pay, better housing, and greater social standing. Towns began to flourish as former peasants moved into urban areas seeking new opportunities. Guilds grew stronger, offering structure and support to skilled laborers who were rapidly becoming essential to the economy. The social consequences of these changes were profound. The rigid hierarchy of medieval society began to loosen. While nobles still held political authority, their economic power weakened. Peasants and urban workers gained leverage they had never possessed before. For the first time in generations, individuals had the ability to improve their station in life through work, negotiation, and strategic movement. This gradual transformation laid the groundwork for the emergence of a middle class in the centuries to come. But these changes did not occur without conflict. The ruling classes resisted the loss of control, and their attempts to restrict labor rights fueled growing resentment among the working classes. This tension erupted in uprisings across Europe, including the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. While these revolts were ultimately suppressed, they revealed a fundamental shift in social consciousness. The working classes had tasted power, and they were no longer willing to accept the conditions that had defined their lives before the plague. This first chapter sets the foundation for understanding how the Black Death reshaped labor rights and social mobility. In the chapters that follow, we will explore in detail how wages changed, how land ownership shifted, how the feudal system weakened, how revolts challenged political authority, how women entered new economic roles, and how the long-term transformation of Europe began with a single devastating pandemic. To understand the true impact of the Black Death on labor and social mobility, we must look closely at what happened in the years immediately following the first wave of the plague. The demographic collapse was so severe that entire regions struggled to maintain even the most basic economic functions. Fields went untilled, mills stood silent, harvests rotted in the soil, and trade networks broke down due to the lack of people able to transport goods or manage markets. The economic structure of pre-plague Europe had relied on constant, steady labor. Without that labor, the system could not continue as it was. This labor crisis forced landowners into a desperate position. For generations, they had enjoyed the stability provided by an abundant and largely powerless workforce. But now, peasants who had survived the plague found themselves in a rare position of advantage. If a lord refused to meet their demands for better wages or lighter obligations, they could simply leave and find work elsewhere. While laws technically restricted such movement, enforcement was weak, and landowners often looked the other way because they needed the workers so badly. This new reality created an unprecedented moment in European labor history. Workers were able to negotiate. For the first time in centuries, peasants could set conditions rather than merely accepting them. In some areas, wages doubled or even tripled. Agricultural laborers found they could demand payment in coin rather than in kind or obligation. Skilled workers, such as carpenters, millers, and blacksmiths, became so scarce that their earnings surged. Landowners, previously accustomed to dictating terms, now had to compete with one another to attract the remaining laborers. This shift in bargaining power led to significant changes not only in wages, but also in working conditions. Workers began insisting on shorter hours, more rest days, and better treatment. Many also rejected the old system of feudal obligations, in which a serf's labor was tied to the land itself. Instead, they sought contracts with clearer, more favorable terms. In some places, the very nature of agricultural work changed as smaller plots were consolidated or abandoned, forcing landowners to rethink how estates were managed. In response to these upheavals, the ruling classes attempted to force society back into its old structure. The English Statute of Labourers, for example, was a sweeping and desperate law passed in 1351 that aimed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and make it illegal for workers to leave their employers. It also imposed harsh penalties on those who offered or accepted higher wages. The statute was rooted in fear, the fear that the balance of power had permanently shifted and that the lower classes might gain autonomy that threatened the long-standing social order. But laws alone could not bridge the gap between economic need and dwindling manpower. Even when officials issued fines or punishments, landowners secretly paid higher wages to entice workers to their estates. In some cases, they openly defied the law, arguing that without labor, their lands would fall into ruin. The enforcement of labor laws became a tug-of-war between governments struggling to preserve hierarchy and employers struggling to survive economically. The church, too, felt the impact of the changing labor landscape. With so many clergy lost to the plague, positions within monasteries and churches needed to be filled. This opened opportunities for individuals who previously lacked the social standing or financial resources to enter religious life. As a result, some people of lower birth found themselves rising into positions of authority within the church, contributing further to the gradual erosion of rigid social distinctions. Labor mobility became a defining characteristic of the post-plague years. Before the Black Death, the vast majority of peasants lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. Their legal and economic obligations bound them to a single lord and a fixed plot of land. After the plague, however, survivors began traveling to neighboring towns, distant villages, and new regions in search of better opportunities. The surge in movement weakened the traditional relationship between landowners and laborers, fostering a new sense of independence among the working population. This increased mobility also brought cultural changes. Peasants were exposed to new customs, new communities, and new economic arrangements as they moved. They saw how other villages operated, how other lords treated their workers, and how wealth could be earned outside the rigid confines of feudalism. These experiences broadened their horizons and sparked new expectations. People began to imagine futures that extended beyond their inherited roles, and they began to question the fairness of systems that had once seemed unchangeable. In cities, the labor shortage accelerated the growth of a wage-based economy. Prior to the plague, many urban workers belonged to guilds that strictly regulated trades and restricted access to apprenticeships. After the plague, guilds found themselves struggling to maintain their numbers. Many loosened admission requirements, allowing individuals from lower social classes to enter skilled professions. This shift enabled more people to gain economic independence and improve their social standing through craftsmanship and trade. In some cases, entire families rose from poverty to modest comfort within a generation. A family that had once been bound to agricultural labor might send a surviving son to apprentice as a mason or a tailor. That son, earning high wages due to labor scarcity, could support his family, purchase land, or even buy his freedom from a lord. Such mobility had been extraordinarily rare before the Black Death, and it marked the beginning of a long-term transformation that would eventually lead to the rise of a true middle class. When examining the long arc of European history, the Black Death can be seen as one of the catalysts for the collapse of the feudal system. Feudalism depended on a stable and predictable supply of labor, a supply that the plague shattered beyond repair. Though feudal institutions lingered for centuries in some areas, the foundations were permanently weakened in the decades that followed the pandemic. Laborers, once bound by law and tradition, found themselves holding bargaining power they were unwilling to relinquish. Lords, facing economic pressures they had never known, struggled to adapt to a world in which their authority was no longer absolute. These early shifts in labor and mobility set the stage for larger political and cultural changes that would unfold in the 14th and 15th centuries. The weakening of feudalism contributed to the rise of centralized monarchies, the growth of cities, and the emergence of markets that relied more on wages than on customary obligations. It also opened the door for future reforms in law, taxation, and governance, as societies attempted to rebuild themselves in ways that matched the new economic realities. In Chapter 3, we will explore how the changes sparked by the Black Death led to conflicts and uprisings across Europe, including major peasant revolts that challenged political authority and reshaped social expectations for generations to come. As the immediate shock of the Black Death began to subside, the profound economic and social changes it unleashed created simmering tensions across Europe. These tensions eventually boiled over into open conflict. For generations, peasants and laborers had endured strict controls, limited rights, and heavy burdens under the feudal system. Their roles had been firmly fixed, and any resistance to the established order was swiftly punished. But after the plague, with labor scarce and economic leverage shifting into the hands of workers, these long-standing frustrations found new fuel. The authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, had tried desperately to reassert control through labor laws that restricted wages and mobility. These laws were not merely economic tools, they were an attempt to preserve a social hierarchy that had been destabilized. Workers found them deeply unjust, an effort by elites to force them back into subservience despite the obvious changes in the economic landscape. As these tensions grew stronger, conflict became inevitable. One of the most famous examples of this unrest is the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, also known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion. Though it occurred several decades after the first wave of the Black Death, its causes were directly rooted in the demographic and economic shifts the plague had created. Peasants resented the ongoing attempts to cap wages and reinforce feudal obligations. They were infuriated by taxes imposed to fund military campaigns in France and angered by legal restrictions that prevented them from seeking better employment. Even more importantly, they were increasingly aware of their own value. They had discovered bargaining power, and they were determined not to lose it. The revolt began in Essex and Kent, regions where discontent ran particularly deep. Groups of peasants banded together, protesting not only harsh economic conditions, but also the corruption and abuses of local officials. What made this uprising so unusual was the speed with which it spread and the sophistication of its demands. The rebels did not merely complain about taxes or poor treatment. They called for the end of serfdom, the removal of corrupt leaders, and greater political rights. They marched on London, gathering support along the way and stunning the ruling class with the size and determination of their movement. While the revolt was ultimately suppressed, its impact reverberated across England. Although the leaders were executed and the monarchy reasserted control, the underlying social changes that had fueled the rebellion could not be reversed. Serfdom, already weakened by the plague, continued to decline. Lords increasingly relied on wage labor rather than customary obligations. The idea that common people could rise in protest and could articulate demands for rights planted seeds that would influence future generations. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe. In France, the peasant revolt known as the Jacquerie erupted in 1358. Like the English revolt, it was driven by anger over oppressive taxation, corruption, and the unwillingness of nobles to acknowledge the changing economic reality. The Jacquerie, though brutally crushed by the nobility, revealed deep fractures in French society. It also reflected the growing confidence of peasants who understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had the power to disrupt the established order when pushed too far. In the Holy Roman Empire, various regions experienced their own uprisings and confrontations. Though many were smaller and more localized, they all shared similar themes: resentment toward feudal obligations, frustration with attempts to control wages, and increased awareness among peasants that their labor had newfound value. Even in regions where revolts did not occur, there were widespread acts of subtle resistance. Peasants quietly refused to work extra hours, demanded payment in coin instead of kind, or negotiated terms with neighboring lords willing to overlook legal restrictions in exchange for labor. These revolts and acts of resistance were not simply reactions to economic hardship. They were signs of a deeper shift in collective consciousness. Before the Black Death, most peasants had accepted their place in society as unchangeable. They believed their roles were ordained by tradition or divine order. But once opportunities for mobility appeared, and once they experienced the power of negotiation, they could not simply revert to old expectations. The plague had not only changed the structure of the economy, it had changed people's understanding of themselves. At the same time, landowners faced their own challenges. Many were struggling to maintain their estates and meet tax obligations despite significant reductions in revenue. Some nobles attempted to reimpose strict controls on labor, but they often found themselves unable to enforce these rules. Others reluctantly embraced the shift toward wage labor, even though it reduced their authority. Over time, a growing number recognized that the old system was simply no longer sustainable. They adapted by leasing land, reducing direct oversight, or diversifying their economic activities. As social tensions played out in the countryside, cities across Europe experienced their own transformations. Urban workers, emboldened by the new economic conditions, organized themselves to demand better working conditions and higher wages. Strikes, though not common in the medieval sense, began to emerge in various towns. Guilds gained power as labor became more valuable, and their influence extended into local politics. In cities such as Florence, Paris, and London, the economic and political balance shifted as artisans and merchants gained leverage that rivaled traditional elites. Another factor that contributed to social upheaval was the shifting attitude toward land itself. In pre-plague Europe, land was the ultimate determinant of wealth and status, and control over it was tightly guarded. But after the Black Death, with so many estates abandoned or poorly managed, land became more accessible. Peasants acquired plots, either by inheritance, purchase, or long-term lease. In some cases, entire villages reorganized around new ownership patterns. This redistribution of land subtly but powerfully altered the social fabric. Land ownership brought autonomy, security, and influence, qualities once reserved mostly for the nobility. The long-term effect of these changes was the gradual erosion of the feudal system. While feudal obligations did not disappear immediately, their economic foundation had been destroyed. Peasants could not be compelled to work when labor was in such short supply. Lords could not maintain strict hierarchies when survival depended on attracting willing workers. Over time, the very notion of hereditary, unchangeable social roles began to weaken. A new world was emerging, one in which economic relationships were defined more by contracts and wages than by tradition and obligation. As we move forward in this documentary, we will examine not only the uprisings and conflicts sparked by the Black Death, but also the long-term transformations in law, culture, gender roles, and economic theory that grew out of this period. The plague was a tragedy beyond measure, but it also served as a catalyst for change that reshaped Europe in ways that still influence the modern world. To understand the long-term social mobility that emerged after the Black Death, we must explore the transformation of land ownership inheritance, and economic opportunity in the generations following the plague. Before the Black Death, land was the central resource that defined the medieval economy. It determined wealth, power, and social status. Yet for the vast majority of people, especially peasants and serfs, land was not something they could own. They worked it, lived on it, and depended on it, but it did not belong to them. Ownership was concentrated in the hands of nobles, monasteries, and wealthy elites. Social mobility was nearly impossible because the boundaries of property and privilege were rigid and enforced by law. The demographic collapse of the Black Death altered these boundaries in a dramatic fashion. As mortality soared, entire families died out, leaving fields untended and properties without heirs. Villages were abandoned and estates fragmented. Land that had once been carefully passed down through generations of nobility suddenly found itself without a clear chain of inheritance. In many cases, the closest surviving relative might be a distant cousin, a minor official, or no one at all. Authorities struggled to manage this unprecedented legal disruption. For peasants, however, this upheaval created openings that had never existed before. Local lords, desperate to restore productivity to their estates, began offering favorable leases to attract tenants. These leases often granted greater autonomy, reduced obligations, and fixed rents rather than labor services. In some cases, peasants could inherit abandoned plots simply by agreeing to work them. Over time, families who had once been bound to a manor found themselves managing land with a degree of freedom that would have been unimaginable only decades earlier. This shift represented a subtle but powerful change in the relationship between land and labor. Under feudalism, labor had been tied to the land in ways that benefited landowners. After the plague, land became tied to labor in ways that benefited workers. The scarcity of people meant that labor was now the rare and valuable resource, and land, previously abundant in workers, became far less useful without someone to cultivate it. This inversion of value helped accelerate the decline of serfdom. Many peasants negotiated their release from feudal obligations, agreeing to pay rent instead of performing traditional services such as ploughing their lord's demesne fields or providing labor during harvest. The transformation of land ownership also altered patterns of family wealth. In pre-plague Europe, most peasants owned few goods of significant value, and their ability to accumulate wealth was strictly limited. But as wages rose and opportunities expanded, some families began to save money, purchase livestock, and invest in tools or improvements to their property. Over a generation or two, these modest gains could accumulate into meaningful resources. A peasant who once lived at the edge of subsistence might find himself able to purchase additional land, hire laborers, or secure opportunities for his children. These changes did not occur evenly across Europe. Some regions, especially those with dense populations or strong centralized control, tried to preserve feudal structures for longer periods. But even in these areas, the underlying economic forces created by the plague proved difficult to resist. Landowners found it increasingly impractical to enforce obligations on laborers when those laborers could simply leave. While laws existed to prevent such mobility, the reality on the ground made them ineffective. Enforcement required manpower that governments lacked, and corruption among local officials meant that many turned a blind eye to peasants who violated restrictions in exchange for small payments or favors. In areas where feudalism loosened quickly, social mobility accelerated. Families that had once lived under the strict oversight of a lord now experienced greater independence. They could make decisions about how to allocate their time, how to manage their land, and how to educate their children. Some began to send sons to towns to apprentice in skilled trades, opening entirely new paths for advancement. Others diversified their income by engaging in local markets, producing surplus goods, or trading livestock. The post-plague economy rewarded initiative in ways that the old system never had. Another factor that reshaped social mobility was the growing importance of cities. Urban centers had always played a role in medieval life, but they became far more attractive in the aftermath of the Black Death. With many artisans and merchants dead, guilds had no choice but to welcome newcomers to maintain production. This shift lowered barriers to entry for skilled professions. Young men from rural backgrounds, who once would have spent their lives working in fields, could now pursue careers as weavers, masons, metalworkers, or merchants. The wages for these roles were high due to the labor shortage, and guild membership provided stability, protection, and opportunities for advancement. Women, too, found new opportunities in the post-plague economy. With so many men lost to the pandemic, women were often required to take on roles traditionally reserved for males. They became heads of households, managed farms, conducted trade, and assumed leadership roles within families and communities. In towns, widows often took over their husbands' businesses. While women still faced legal and cultural constraints, the necessity created by the plague allowed them to step into positions of responsibility that would otherwise have been denied to them. This shift was not uniform across Europe, but in many regions, it contributed to a slow expansion of women's economic agency. The cumulative effect of these changes was the gradual emergence of a more fluid and dynamic social structure. While medieval society did not transform overnight into a modern meritocracy, the rigid hierarchies of the pre-plague world began to soften. Wealth was no longer exclusively tied to noble birth. Skill, initiative, and mobility became increasingly important factors in determining a person's prospects. A new, more flexible social landscape emerged, one that would eventually support the development of a true middle class in the centuries to come. The rise of this middle class played a crucial role in the broader cultural shifts of late medieval and early Renaissance Europe. As artisans, merchants, and landowning peasants gained wealth and influence, they became consumers of goods, art, and education. They contributed to the growth of universities, the expansion of trade networks, and the cultural revitalization that defined the Renaissance. While the Renaissance had many causes, the demographic and economic changes triggered by the Black Death created fertile ground for this flowering of creativity and intellectual exploration. In political terms, the redistribution of economic power affected relationships between monarchs and nobles. Kings found themselves negotiating with stronger towns and wealthier commoners, relying increasingly on monetary taxation rather than feudal obligations. Some monarchies used this new dependence on cash to centralize authority, undermining the traditional power of the nobility. This shift played a role in the evolution of modern state systems, particularly in Western Europe, where centralized monarchies gradually replaced decentralized feudal structures. Despite these significant changes, the transition was not smooth or uniform. Many regions experienced periods of social instability as communities tried to navigate the shifting economic landscape. Conflicts between landlords and tenants, disputes over wages, and debates about inherited rights became common. Yet, despite resistance from traditional elites, the fundamental shift in labor power could not be reversed. The scarcity of workers ensured that even where feudal structures tried to persist, economic realities gradually undermined them. As this chapter draws to a close, we can see how the Black Death served as a catalyst for the reorganization of European society. It broke the economic foundations of the feudal system, created opportunities for peasants and townspeople, and paved the way for a new social order defined by flexibility, negotiation, and mobility. In Chapter 5, we will explore how these economic and social transformations influenced cultural attitudes, education, governance, and the long-term evolution of European identity. To fully understand how the Black Death reshaped labor rights and social mobility, we must now turn to the shifting cultural attitudes that emerged in the decades and centuries after the pandemic. Economic changes may have altered wages, land ownership, and work conditions, but it was cultural change, slow, widespread, and deeply felt, that truly transformed the fabric of European society. The plague did not simply create new opportunities, it forced people to rethink their place in the world. Before the Black Death, the medieval worldview revolved around stability, tradition, and the belief that social order was divinely ordained. A peasant was a peasant because God had placed him there. A noble was a noble for the same reason. Medieval religious teaching emphasized obedience and the acceptance of one's role in life. Upward mobility was neither expected nor encouraged, but the immense mortality of the Black Death challenged this worldview. People saw noble families destroyed, wealthy merchants swept away, and monks in monasteries dying alongside peasants in fields. Death had struck with terrifying equality, ignoring status, wealth, and privilege. This frightening realization that status could not protect anyone shattered the illusion that the social hierarchy was part of a divine, unchangeable order. If God allowed nobles and peasants alike to perish, perhaps the boundaries separating them were not as natural as once believed. The sense that life was unpredictable, fragile, and fundamentally unstable encouraged people to question old assumptions. This intellectual shift did not overturn society overnight, but it created fertile ground for new ideas about individual agency, self-determination, and the value of human labor. The rise of wage labor further contributed to this change in mindset. When labor became something that people could sell, and wages became something they could negotiate, the idea of personal worth took on a new dimension. A man's value was no longer tied solely to his birth, his lineage, or his obligations to a lord. It became connected to his skills, his abilities, and his productivity. Though this concept seems obvious to modern eyes, it represented a profound transformation in medieval thought. The plague, by creating labor scarcity and increasing wages, pushed society toward a more individualistic understanding of human value. This shift in attitudes was also visible in changing patterns of consumption and lifestyle. With increased wages and greater opportunities, many families invested in better clothing, household goods, and even luxuries previously reserved for the elite. Markets in towns expanded as common people gained more spending power. Merchants, recognizing the potential of this new customer base, diversified their wares. The growth of consumer culture fostered a sense of personal identity independent of social class. People began to express themselves through the goods they purchased, the clothes they wore, and the tools they used. Education, too, became more accessible. Before the plague, schooling was generally limited to the clergy, the nobility, and a small number of urban elites. But as the economy grew more complex and towns became centers of economic opportunity, literacy and numeracy became increasingly important. Some families used their newfound wealth to educate their children, particularly sons, so they could pursue careers in administration, trade, or specialized crafts. This push toward education had far-reaching effects, helping to fuel the rise of universities, the spread of literacy, and ultimately the birth of the Renaissance. The church itself was forced to evolve in response to the cultural changes brought about by the plague. The Black Death had dealt a severe blow to religious institutions. Many priests, monks, and nuns died while tending to the sick. Some were praised for their bravery, but others were criticized for fleeing in fear. This varied response led many people to question the authority and reliability of the church. If religious leaders could not protect their flock, or even themselves, then perhaps their spiritual power was limited. As criticism grew, so did calls for reform. Mystical movements gained popularity as people sought personal connections with the divine. Lay religious organizations, including confraternities and guilds, became more active in promoting charity, education, and community leadership. These organizations were often composed of ordinary citizens, giving them an opportunity to shape religious expression in their local communities. This increased involvement of common people in religious life laid the groundwork for later religious transformations, including the Reformation. The plague also influenced cultural expressions such as art, literature, and philosophy. Artists began to depict death, suffering, and the fragility of life with greater intensity. The Danse Macabre motif, showing death leading people of all social classes in a grim procession, became a powerful symbol of the era. Such imagery reflected not only the devastation of the pandemic, but also the growing belief that social distinctions mattered little in the face of mortality. Literature, too, captured this shifting consciousness. Writers explored themes of inequality, corruption, and the unpredictability of fate. These cultural productions served as mirrors to a society grappling with profound change. One particularly important cultural development was the growing recognition of individual rights. While modern notions of human rights were still centuries away, the seeds were planted in post-plague societies. As peasants negotiated contracts, demanded fair wages, and asserted their autonomy, they began to articulate ideas that would eventually shape later philosophies of freedom, justice, and equality. Medieval charters and local legal reforms began to reflect the increasing importance of individual agreements rather than inherited obligations. This emerging focus on individual rights played a significant role in weakening the institutions of feudalism. Feudal society depended on collective, hereditary obligations, but as workers pushed for contractual arrangements based on mutual consent, the old system began to crumble. Even where noble families attempted to reassert control, economic realities undermined their efforts. A lord who refused to negotiate could find his fields empty, his estate impoverished, and his authority eroded. Gradually, even reluctant landowners were forced to accept new legal frameworks that reflected the changing social landscape. One of the most enduring cultural consequences of the Black Death was the development of a more dynamic, flexible class system. While the medieval social order never entirely dissolved, the rigidity that once defined it weakened significantly. People began to move not only geographically, but socially. A talented craftsman could rise to prominence in a town. A peasant family that acquired land could achieve moderate wealth. A merchant with successful trade connections could rival minor nobles in influence. These developments gradually eroded the idea that social position was fixed by birth. The transformation of class structure contributed to long-term political changes as well. Monarchs increasingly relied on towns and merchants for financial support, reducing their dependence on the nobility. This shift helped centralize power in the hands of kings and queens, leading to stronger national governments. While these changes came slowly and unevenly, they marked a significant departure from the decentralized, lord-dominated politics of the earlier medieval period. In the centuries following the plague, Europe continued to evolve into a society that valued individual achievement, innovation, and economic participation. These ideals would become central to later intellectual movements, including humanism, which emphasized the potential of the individual and the importance of education. Without the demographic and economic upheaval triggered by the Black Death, this intellectual shift might never have taken root so deeply. As we conclude this chapter, it becomes clear that the Black Death's impact extended far beyond immediate changes in labor and wages. It sparked a cultural transformation that reshaped how people thought about themselves, their work, their rights, and their place in society. It was a turning point that moved Europe away from rigid medieval structures and toward a more modern understanding of human potential and social mobility. To fully grasp the impact of the Black Death on labor rights and social mobility, we must look closely at how legal reforms, both intentional and unintentional, reshaped the relationship between workers, landowners, and governing authorities. Although medieval governments attempted to preserve traditional hierarchies through strict wage controls and mobility restrictions, many of these efforts ultimately contributed to the long-term transformation of European law. In many ways, the struggle to enforce outdated regulations revealed the growing power and autonomy of the laboring classes. Before the Black Death, medieval law reinforced the rigidity of the feudal system. Contracts were rare, labor obligations were inherited rather than negotiated, and most people had little legal recourse against their superiors. But after the plague, as workers began to assert their value and demand better terms, the legal landscape shifted. Even though much of this change was gradual, the foundations of a more modern legal system began to emerge. One of the most significant legal responses to the labor shortage was the attempt to control wages. The English Statute of Labourers in 1351 is often cited as the clearest example, but similar laws appeared elsewhere in Europe. These laws were intended to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, criminalize the movement of workers seeking higher pay, and punish employers who offered more generous terms. They represent one of the earliest examples of governments attempting to regulate wages on a national scale. But these laws largely failed. The reality of labor scarcity made enforcement nearly impossible. Workers were willing to take risks to secure better pay, and employers were willing to break the law to secure workers. Courts became clogged with cases in which laborers were accused of violating wage controls or fleeing their obligations. Yet many judges, themselves facing economic pressures, applied the laws inconsistently. Some fines were reduced or dismissed entirely, especially when local economies were desperate for recovery. The frequent failure of these labor laws had an unexpected effect. It demonstrated to workers that the law could be challenged. In the centuries before the plague, legal resistance by peasants had been rare and dangerous. After the plague, however, workers saw that they could negotiate, violate restrictive rules, and even organize collectively without necessarily facing harsh consequences. This newfound confidence gradually became embedded in social consciousness. Legal contracts became increasingly important during this period. As feudal obligations weakened, peasants, tenants, artisans, and employers turned to written agreements to define their relationships. Contracts offered clarity and protection in a rapidly changing economic environment. They allowed workers to secure fixed wages, determine hours, and formalize obligations in ways that might have been unthinkable before the plague. Landowners, too, benefited from contracts because they provided stability and minimized disputes. These contracts represent an important shift in medieval legal culture. They emphasized consent rather than coercion. In feudal society, obligations were imposed based on custom and inheritance. After the Black Death, obligations increasingly stemmed from voluntary agreements. Even when the bargaining power between parties was unequal, the legal framework itself began to acknowledge the idea of mutual consent. This was revolutionary in a society that had long treated large segments of its population as bound by birth. As contract use expanded, local courts grew busier and more influential. Judges and legal clerks played a larger role in resolving disputes over wages, rents, land boundaries, and working conditions. These courts, once dominated by elite interests, gradually became spaces where workers could defend their rights. A peasant might sue a landlord for violating a lease agreement or for failing to honor promised wages. While outcomes varied, the mere presence of such disputes in court records shows a society in transition, one in which ordinary people were increasingly willing to assert their rights. Another significant legal transformation involved inheritance. With so many families disrupted or destroyed by the plague, traditional lines of succession broke down. In many areas, laws were modified or interpreted more flexibly to allow distant relatives, widows, or even unrelated individuals to inherit property. This flexibility created new pathways for social advancement. Young men who married widows gained land they would otherwise never have inherited. Extended families consolidated property, creating wealth where none had existed before. In towns, guilds sometimes stepped in to manage inheritances for orphaned apprentices, ensuring they retained access to training and future employment. Women, in particular, benefited from these changes. The high mortality rate meant that women often became heads of households, inheriting land, tools, and businesses. In many cases, widows ran farms, negotiated contracts, and oversaw laborers. While women still faced legal restrictions, their increased role in managing family assets shifted social attitudes about their economic capabilities. These changes laid early groundwork for the slow, uneven expansion of women's autonomy in the centuries to come. Taxation also underwent transformation during this period. As labor mobility increased and feudal obligations changed, governments struggled to secure revenue. Traditional feudal dues declined as serfdom weakened, and monarchs increasingly turned to monetary taxation. This change expanded the role of cash economies and further incentivized wage-based labor systems. In some regions, tax burdens shifted toward wealthier landowners or towns, indirectly supporting the economic rise of smaller landholders and workers who were less bound to feudal dues. In addition to wage controls and inheritance laws, labor legislation began to emerge in forms recognizable to modern eyes. For example, regulations on apprenticeship, working hours, and the rights of skilled laborers became more common. Guilds played a significant role in shaping these emerging labor laws. In cities where guilds grew more powerful due to labor scarcity, they established rules to protect the quality of work, the rights of apprentices, and the wages of masters. Though guilds could be exclusive and conservative, they also served as early protectors of labor rights, offering workers stability and legal recognition. The decline of serfdom is perhaps the most important legal transformation of this era. While the institution did not vanish immediately, its economic foundation was shattered beyond repair. Over the decades following the plague, more peasants bought or negotiated their freedom. Some lords willingly converted serfs into tenant farmers who paid rent instead of providing labor. In other cases, serfdom simply faded away as peasants left estates and landlords lacked the power to compel their return. By the late 15th century, in many parts of Western Europe, serfdom was either gone or vastly diminished. These legal changes reshaped the framework of European society. They shifted power away from hereditary elites and toward individuals and families. They made mobility possible, geographically, economically, and socially. And they gradually replaced a system built on tradition and obligation with one rooted in negotiation and mutual agreements. As we transition into the next chapter, we will look at how the changes sparked by the Black Death transformed urban life, trade networks, and the growth of industries, ultimately contributing to the rise of a more interconnected European economy. To continue understanding the far-reaching consequences of the Black Death, we must now turn to the transformation that took place in Europe's towns and cities. While rural labor patterns and land ownership underwent dramatic changes, urban centers experienced their own upheavals. The plague did not simply reduce populations, it fundamentally altered the structure of labor markets, the organization of industry, and the flow of trade. In doing so, it helped reshape urban society in ways that would define the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. Before the Black Death, cities had already been centers of economic and cultural activity, but their growth was constrained by the rigid boundaries of guild membership, limited mobility for rural workers, and the dominance of long-established merchant families. Many skilled trades were tightly guarded, with apprenticeships lasting years and access granted only to those with connections or birthright. This scarcity of opportunity meant that urban mobility was limited. Even talented individuals often found themselves unable to advance without the approval of powerful guild masters. The demographic devastation of the plague changed this overnight. Entire guild lines died out, workshops closed, and merchant networks collapsed due to the loss of key individuals. Skilled laborers became as scarce in cities as agricultural workers were in the countryside. This scarcity opened doors that had previously been shut. Guilds, desperate to maintain production levels, lowered their barriers to entry. People from rural backgrounds who had once been excluded from skilled trades now found opportunities to apprentice and eventually become masters in their own right. This infusion of new workers into urban centers reshaped the dynamics of cities. Many individuals who had once been bound to rural labor began moving to towns in search of better wages, greater autonomy, and new prospects. In some places, the population decline was so severe that city leaders actively recruited workers, offering incentives such as tax breaks, freedom from feudal obligations, or land within city walls. These measures contributed to the growth of more diverse and economically vibrant urban communities. The influx of new labor also fueled the expansion of industries. Textile production, one of the most important economic sectors of medieval Europe, experienced significant shifts. With consumers increasingly able to afford higher quality goods due to rising wages, demand for textiles surged. Workshops that had once struggled to compete with cheap rural labor now found new markets. This encouraged further specialization and innovation in weaving, dyeing, and finishing techniques. The textile industry became a major driver of urban growth, especially in regions such as Flanders, northern Italy, and parts of Germany. Trade networks also shifted in the aftermath of the plague. With fewer people available to transport goods, merchants were forced to reconfigure their routes, collaborate more closely with other traders, and invest in new infrastructure. The decline in population initially reduced demand for some goods, but the increase in wealth among surviving workers quickly stimulated new forms of consumption. Luxury items such as fine cloth, spices, and metalwork gained popularity among the emerging middle class. Cities with strong commercial ties rebounded faster than those that relied primarily on local production, leading to increased economic specialization across regions. The rise in trade helped strengthen merchant guilds and banking families, particularly in urban centers like Venice, Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck. These cities leveraged their strategic locations and commercial networks to become powerhouses of finance. Banking families such as the Medici in Florence and the Fuggers in Augsburg rose to prominence during this era, aided indirectly by the economic restructuring that followed the plague. Their wealth gave them immense political influence, reshaping local governance and laying the economic foundation for the Renaissance. Urban wages also played a crucial role in shaping social mobility. Skilled workers in trades such as metalworking, shipbuilding, masonry, and carpentry saw significant increases in earnings. These higher wages gave artisans the opportunity to invest in their own workshops, purchase property, or support their children's education. Over time, many urban families rose into what would later be recognized as the middle class. They became active participants in city councils, guild leadership, and civic institutions, exercising influence that rivaled or even surpassed some members of the traditional nobility. One notable consequence of the urban labor shortage was the increased social mobility of women. As in rural areas, the loss of male workers meant that women often had to take on new responsibilities. In towns, many women inherited their husbands' businesses or took over workshops in textiles, brewing, baking, or metal trades. Some guilds, faced with pressure to maintain production, relaxed their restrictions and allowed women greater participation. Even when formal recognition was limited, women often performed essential work behind the scenes, managing household production and contributing to the economic vitality of their communities. This increased participation in economic life challenged traditional gender norms. Women who successfully ran businesses, negotiated contracts, or oversaw apprentices demonstrated their capability in roles typically reserved for men. While the gains made by women varied widely between regions and rarely translated into equal legal rights, they nonetheless contributed to a gradual shift in perceptions about gender and economic contribution. These shifts would later influence the broader cultural and intellectual transformations of the Renaissance period. Urban governance also changed during this era. As wealth became more widely distributed, city councils saw increased participation from non-noble citizens. Merchants, artisans, and guild representatives gained a greater voice in local politics, often advocating for reforms that supported trade, infrastructure, and public services. These changes helped lay the foundation for more representative forms of government in cities across Europe. In some places, such as the Italian city-states, these developments set the stage for vibrant civic cultures that emphasized public debate, patronage of the arts, and active citizenship. Public health practices evolved as well, shaped by the memory of the plague. Cities introduced new measures to monitor disease, regulate sanitation, and control the movement of people and goods. Quarantine laws, first implemented during the plague, became standard features of urban policy. These regulations reflected a growing awareness of public health as a civic responsibility, influencing how cities managed epidemics for centuries to come. The psychological impact of the Black Death also played a role in reshaping urban life. Survivors carried with them the memory of loss and devastation, but also a heightened sense of opportunity. Many viewed life as fragile and uncertain, and this awareness prompted them to pursue economic advancement, education, or artistic expression with greater urgency. The flourishing of art, architecture, and literature in the 14th and 15th centuries cannot be separated from the emotional and cultural transformations unleashed by the plague. Urban labor markets became more fluid and dynamic, encouraging innovation and competition. Workers who excelled in their craft could rise quickly, opening opportunities for their families for generations to come. The movement of laborers between cities also facilitated the exchange of ideas, techniques, and cultural influences, contributing to Europe's increasing interconnectedness. Cities became engines of cultural change, economic growth, and social mobility, setting the stage for the Renaissance and early modern transformations that followed. As we leave this chapter behind, we turn next to the economic theories and philosophical reflections that emerged from the post-plague era. Scholars, theologians, and reformers began to contemplate the nature of wealth, the rights of workers, and the balance between individual freedom and societal obligations. In Chapter 8, we will explore how the Black Death contributed to the intellectual foundations of modern economic and political thought. As Europe slowly recovered from the devastation of the Black Death, intellectual life also began to shift in ways that would have been unimaginable before the plague. The dramatic changes in labor markets, social structures, and economic relationships forced scholars, theologians, and early economists to reconsider long-held assumptions about wealth, justice, and the rights of workers. Though the development of formal economic theory was still centuries away, the seeds of new ideas were being planted across universities, monasteries, merchant guilds, and informal scholarly circles. Before the Black Death, most European thinking about society and economics was rooted in medieval scholasticism, a system that sought to reconcile Christian doctrine with Aristotelian philosophy. The scholastic worldview emphasized harmony, hierarchy, and the idea that each person had a divinely assigned place within the social order. Wealth was seen with suspicion, labor was viewed as a duty, and social mobility was generally discouraged. But the plague shook these assumptions in profound ways. When half the population disappeared, the idea of a divinely fixed hierarchy suddenly seemed less convincing. And when workers gained bargaining power, debates about wealth and labor became unavoidable. One of the first intellectual shifts involved changing attitudes toward labor itself. In the medieval mindset, physical labor, especially agricultural work, was often considered a lower calling, a duty owed by peasants as part of the natural order. But after the plague, as labor became scarce and wages rose, work took on a new meaning. Scholars began to acknowledge its economic value. Theologians wrote treatises defending fair compensation for laborers, arguing that wages should reflect both effort and the needs of workers. While still deeply rooted in moral theology, these writings pushed Europe toward a more modern conception of labor as an economic contribution rather than a social obligation. The concept of just wages became a major topic of debate. Before the Black Death, just wages were often assumed to be low, reflecting a stable and abundant labor supply. After the plague, scholars were forced to confront the reality that labor scarcity made higher wages not only possible but necessary. Some theologians argued that setting wages artificially low, through laws like the Statute of Laborers, violated Christian principles. Others insisted that maintaining pre-plague wages was essential to preserve social order. This intellectual conflict mirrored the real-world struggle between workers seeking fair compensation and elites attempting to maintain control. Even more revolutionary was the idea that individuals might deserve the freedom to negotiate their own economic futures. The plague's disruption of hereditary obligations led to the increasing use of contracts, and contracts required a new intellectual framework to justify them. Scholars began to explore the idea that agreements between individuals could be morally binding, even without direct reference to traditional hierarchies. This subtle shift contributed to the later development of contract theory, which would become one of the pillars of modern economic and legal thought. Alongside these changes, a growing number of thinkers began to question the rigid social stratification of medieval society. If peasants could earn enough money to buy land, educate their children, or invest in trade, did that mean social class was more fluid than previously believed? Could individuals rise or fall based on merit, skills, or opportunities rather than birth? While few medieval scholars openly supported the idea of widespread social mobility, many began to acknowledge that the post-plague world was different. Economic value was no longer solely determined by noble lineage or church authority. Instead, it was increasingly shaped by productivity, skill, and the ability to adapt. This shift in mindset was especially evident in urban environments, where the rising merchant class began to challenge the dominance of the nobility. Wealthy merchants, bankers, and skilled artisans accumulated influence through economic success rather than inherited privilege. Their growing power forced scholars to examine the legitimacy of different sources of wealth and authority. In many cities, civic leaders came not from ancient noble families, but from successful business ventures. This inversion of prestige would have been unthinkable before the Black Death. The plague also influenced early thinking about economics through its impact on supply and demand. Although medieval scholars did not articulate these concepts in modern terms, many writers observed that the scarcity of labor increased wages, while the abundance of land reduced rents. They noted that prices rose or fell based on availability, and they attempted to interpret these changes through moral, theological, or philosophical lenses. These debates mark some of the earliest European reflections on what would one day become core economic principles. Intellectuals were not the only ones grappling with these changes. Ordinary people, too, developed new understandings of fairness, justice, and opportunity. Surviving workers compared wages across estates or cities, negotiated better terms, and made decisions that reflected nascent ideas about self-worth and personal agency. Even those with little formal education became participants in shaping economic thought through their everyday actions. The plague also had an unexpected impact on attitudes toward wealth accumulation. Before the pandemic, excessive wealth was often condemned as sinful or morally dangerous. But after the plague, with so many families devastated and so much property left behind, wealth was redistributed on an unprecedented scale. Individuals who inherited land or tools were suddenly thrust into positions of responsibility, and the need to rebuild communities softened ideological resistance to wealth. Scholars began writing about the responsible use of wealth rather than condemning its possession outright. This shift laid early foundations for the later acceptance of capitalist principles. One of the most interesting intellectual developments of the post-plague era was the emerging belief that people could shape their own destinies. The idea that individual effort could lead to a better life gained momentum. This belief was not simply economic, it was philosophical. It marked the beginning of a more human-centered worldview, which would become central to Renaissance humanism. Humanist thinkers emphasized the potential of individuals to improve themselves through education, skill, and virtue. Although humanism had many roots, the dramatic social mobility that followed the Black Death was one of the conditions that made its rise possible. Humanist ideals also influenced political thought. As more people gained access to resources and education, they began to expect a greater say in local governance. City councils expanded, guilds gained political influence, and parliaments or representative bodies became more active in some regions. This growing participation challenged the absolute authority of nobles and contributed to the early development of more inclusive political structures. The relationship between the church and the population also changed in ways that had intellectual implications. The clergy's uneven response to the plague, some heroic, others cowardly, led many people to question the spiritual and moral authority of religious leaders. This skepticism encouraged independent religious thinking, which over time contributed to reform movements and the eventual fracturing of the church during the Reformation. The seeds of that transformation can be found in the chaos and uncertainty of the plague years. Intellectual changes also influenced the arts. Artists broke away from strict medieval symbolism and began focusing more on human emotion, realism, and individuality. This artistic evolution fed back into social attitudes, reinforcing ideas about personal identity, human dignity, and the value of earthly life. In subtle ways, the plague contributed to a cultural environment that favored creativity, innovation, and exploration. As we conclude this chapter, it becomes clear that the Black Death did far more than shift economic conditions. It helped transform the intellectual foundations of European society. Labor rights, social mobility, and individual agency were no longer peripheral or ignored concepts. They became central to emerging ideas about justice, governance, and human potential. As we move deeper into the long-term consequences of the Black Death, it becomes increasingly clear that demographic changes were not merely background conditions. They were central drivers of social transformation. The plague's enormous mortality reshaped population patterns, family structures, migration flows, and community life throughout Europe. These demographic shifts played a crucial role in redefining labor rights and social mobility, influencing how societies recovered, reorganized, and reimagined themselves. Before the Black Death, Europe's population had been steadily rising for centuries. By the early 14th century, the continent was crowded, with many regions struggling to support their people. Marginal lands were cultivated out of necessity, and poverty was widespread. Families tended to be large, partly because children were essential laborers, and partly because high mortality from disease and famine made large households a practical strategy for survival. Villages, towns, and cities were tightly interconnected through systems of customary obligations, guild structures, and feudal responsibilities. The plague shattered this demographic stability. In some areas, mortality reached 60 or 70%. Entire families disappeared, leaving households with one or two survivors, or none at all. Community networks that had held villages together collapsed. The sudden availability of land, homes, and resources fundamentally altered how families structured themselves. For the first time in generations, people found themselves with choices: where to live, what work to pursue, and whom to marry. These choices, once strictly limited by economic necessity, expanded dramatically. One of the most immediate demographic effects of the Black Death was a sharp decline in average household size. Surviving family members often had to reorganize their lives with fewer hands available to work. This encouraged new household formations. Widows remarried, younger siblings inherited property, and unrelated individuals sometimes joined together to manage farms or businesses. The flexibility of these arrangements reflected a broader shift toward pragmatic decision-making in the face of unprecedented challenges. Migration patterns changed dramatically as well. Before the plague, movement was heavily constrained by feudal laws, limited economic opportunities, and deep ties to local communities. After the plague, people moved more freely than at any point in medieval European history. Laborers traveled in search of better wages, tenants sought more favorable land contracts, and artisans relocated to cities where guilds needed new members. This migration reshaped not only urban centers, but also rural landscapes, as abandoned villages were repopulated or left to decay depending on local economic conditions. In some regions, entire settlements vanished permanently. Archaeological evidence shows that hundreds of medieval villages across England, France, Germany, and Italy were deserted in the years following the plague. These lost villages tell a story of demographic collapse that could not be reversed. Workers concentrated in more prosperous areas, leaving marginal lands to return to forest or pasture. This consolidation contributed to improved agricultural efficiency over time, as more productive fields were cultivated by fewer people earning higher wages. The demographic shock also influenced marriage patterns. With so many individuals widowed or without traditional family support networks, people began to marry earlier or later depending on local economic circumstances. Some areas saw a rise in early marriages, especially when women inherited property and needed partners to help manage it. Other regions saw delayed marriages, as young people focused on securing stable employment before forming households. Both trends reflected a growing emphasis on economic decision-making as a key factor in family life. Fertility rates fluctuated as well. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, fertility often rose as survivors attempted to rebuild families and communities. But in the longer term, smaller households and more stable wages encouraged couples to limit the number of children they had, as each child represented an investment rather than merely a pair of hands for labor. This shift in reproductive behavior contributed to a slow but steady transformation in the relationship between family structure and economic planning. Perhaps the most striking demographic change was the gradual increase in life expectancy for those who survived the initial waves of the plague. With fewer people competing for resources, survivors enjoyed better diets, improved living conditions, and more accessible land. These advantages translated into better health, lower infant mortality, and longer lifespans for some segments of the population. While the plague continued to recur periodically, its initial devastation reduced population density in ways that benefited survivors for decades. These demographic transformations had profound effects on labor rights. A smaller population meant that workers were in high demand, giving them leverage to negotiate wages, working conditions, and mobility. But it also meant that families had to make strategic choices about how to allocate labor and resources. Children became investments in the future, education became more valuable, and trades became paths to security that agricultural labor alone could not provide. The plague also altered gender demographics in ways that influenced social mobility. In many areas, women made up a larger share of the surviving population. As a result, they inherited property more frequently, managed farms or businesses, and sometimes participated in local governance. Their increased economic responsibilities, even if temporary, left a lasting imprint on social expectations. Women demonstrated their competence in roles previously dominated by men, subtly shifting cultural perceptions about gender and capability. In urban centers, demographic changes reshaped guild membership. With many guild masters dead, opportunities opened for new apprentices, including individuals from rural backgrounds and sometimes even women. The infusion of new blood revitalized trades that might otherwise have collapsed. Guilds that adapted to new conditions prospered, while those that tried to maintain rigid entry restrictions often declined. Migration also contributed to the spread of ideas. As workers moved from place to place, they carried with them knowledge of wages, contracts, working conditions, and rights. A laborer who had secured favorable terms in one region might encourage others to demand similar conditions elsewhere. This circulation of experience contributed to a growing awareness of economic possibilities and shaped the development of labor consciousness long before the rise of formal labor movements. Another major demographic consequence of the plague was the transformation of social support networks. With so many family members lost, individuals increasingly turned to community institutions, guilds, parish churches, confraternities, and mutual aid organizations for assistance. These groups provided financial support, burial services, and social connections. They also fostered a sense of collective identity and solidarity among workers, reinforcing the idea that economic rights and social well-being were intertwined. Over time, these demographic changes paved the way for a more modern understanding of society. The rigid hierarchical structures of the early medieval period gave way to more dynamic patterns of social organization. People moved more freely, choices expanded, and opportunities emerged in unexpected places. The devastating loss of life had paradoxically created the conditions for greater flexibility, autonomy, and upward mobility. As we continue this documentary, next chapter will examine how the Black Death reshaped rural economies in the long term, exploring the transformation of agricultural practices, land management, and the eventual decline of the traditional manor system. As we reach the final chapter of this documentary, we bring together the many threads woven throughout the complex story of the Black Death and its profound impact on labor rights and social mobility. The plague was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history, a moment so devastating that it fractured the foundations of medieval society. Yet paradoxically, out of this immense loss came transformation. Through tragedy, societies were forced to rebuild, reorganize, and rethink what it meant to work, to survive, and to aspire to something beyond one's inherited station. In the countryside, where the rhythms of medieval life had been stable for centuries, the plague reshaped rural economies in ways that no one could have predicted. Traditional manor systems, which had dominated economic and social life, began to crumble under the pressure of labor scarcity. Before the plague, manorialism depended on large populations to sustain agricultural production. Peasants were expected to work their lord's fields without pay, bound to the land by customary obligations. Their labor was the cornerstone that supported the wealth of noble families. But when the Black Death reduced populations by half or more, the system simply could not function. Lords found themselves facing empty fields and deteriorating estates. With far fewer peasants available, they had little choice but to negotiate, reduce obligations, or convert serf labor into wage labor. Many manors abandoned the old demesne farming model altogether, leasing land to tenants who paid fixed rents rather than performing service. This shift effectively transferred economic control from the landowners to the laborers, who now held scarce and valuable skills. Over time, the rural landscape began to change. Land that was once intensively cultivated reverted to pasture or forest when it no longer made economic sense to farm it. In some regions, sheep herding expanded dramatically, especially in areas where wool production became a major source of export wealth. This shift altered not only local economies, but also regional trade networks, as wool merchants and textile producers found themselves increasingly central to the European economy. Smaller villages that had been barely sustainable before the Black Death were abandoned entirely, their remnants swallowed by nature. Other villages consolidated, with surviving families acquiring larger plots of land. These changes created opportunities for peasants to rise into positions of relative independence and influence. A family that had once struggled to meet subsistence needs might now control multiple fields, hire laborers, and choose how to allocate time and resources. This redistribution of land fundamentally weakened the traditional hierarchy that had placed nobles firmly above peasants in wealth and authority. The economic empowerment of rural workers also contributed to shifts in cultural identity. For generations, peasants had been seen, by themselves and others, as unchangeable parts of a rigid system. But after the plague, when these same peasants became landholders, wage earners, and negotiators, they began to develop a stronger sense of agency. Their work was no longer a compulsory duty. It was a commodity with value. Their skill was no longer assumed. It was essential. This transformation in self-perception resonated across generations, shaping attitudes that would eventually support the rise of modern labor rights. In the long term, the collapse of feudal labor structures contributed to the emergence of a market-driven rural economy. Agricultural decisions became tied to profitability rather than custom. Tenants negotiated rents, invested in tools, and diversified production. Lords adapted by shifting from direct cultivation to leasing and investing in other ventures. A new relationship between land and labor emerged, one that prioritized economic rationality over inherited obligation. These rural transformations also connected with urban changes, creating a feedback loop that pushed Europe toward modernization. As urban centers demanded more food, wool, leather, and raw materials, rural producers found new markets for their goods. Meanwhile, rural families sent children to cities to seek apprenticeships, strengthening ties between communities. This growing interdependence helped break down the stark divide between urban and rural life that had defined medieval Europe. By the 15th century, Europe was no longer the same continent it had been before the plague. The feudal system still existed in many places, but its power had been hollowed out. The authority of nobles was diminished, the importance of merchants and skilled workers was rising, and the concept of labor had been fundamentally altered. Instead of existing solely as a hereditary obligation, labor had become something that could be negotiated, improved, and valued. This redefinition of labor laid the foundation for later economic developments, including the expansion of wage systems, the evolution of contract law, and eventually the birth of capitalism. It also influenced political transformations, as monarchs increasingly relied on taxes from prosperous towns and tenants rather than feudal dues from nobles. Over time, this shift supported the rise of centralized states, national identities, and more formalized systems of governance. Culturally, the trauma of the Black Death reshaped European thought. The questioning of traditional authority, the emphasis on individual potential, and the rise of new intellectual movements such as humanism all grew from soil enriched by the devastating disruption of the old order. These cultural currents would feed into the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, each carrying forward the idea that human beings could shape their own destiny. When we reflect on the story of the Black Death and its aftermath, we see not only tragedy but transformation. We see how labor rights advanced, not because of planned reform, but because of necessity. We see how social mobility emerged not through deliberate policy, but through the collapse of rigid systems. And we see how ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, discovered opportunities that would alter the course of history. The Black Death was a catastrophe beyond measure. But in its wake, it reshaped Europe into a place more dynamic, more mobile, and more open to the idea that individuals could rise, negotiate, and thrive. It laid early groundwork for labor reform, economic modernization, and cultural rebirth. Its legacy is not only one of loss, but one of profound transformation. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most pivotal turning points. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more in-depth stories about how our world was shaped by events both tragic and transformative, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode. Your support helps us create more documentaries just like this, bringing history's most important and often overlooked moments to life.